Awesome. Hi, everyone. Super excited for y'all to be here. I'm Ray, co-founder and co-CEO of Affinity, and I just want to say again, kind of echoing Dustin's word, welcome to Campfire. So we call this event Campfire because I think in a lot of ways it really captures the spirit and ethos of Affinity as a company. I think not just for this conference, but also fundamentally as a company, our most fundamental belief, which is that relationships are the most valuable asset to every firm and every professional in the world. And I think so metaphorically, like we want Campfire to really feel like gathering literally around a campfire. It's probably the most campfire that we've ever done before, literally being in the woods. But as Dustin mentioned, it's about connecting with each other. It's about building relationships. It's about sharing the approaches that we've all been taking and like being open in terms of how we adapted to this very fast changing landscape. And so speaking of a changing landscape, right, I think this is fairly self-evident. You know, we have really hit this inflection point as an industry. The venture private capital mania, it hit its high back in 2020, 2021. Total value of global VC funds raised ballooned. We kept seeing these all-time high rounds, all-time high valuations, but that has since painfully reversed. And so since last year, venture funding has been nothing but like a falling knife. Total capital raised by startups in Q1 of last year dropped over 80% compared to this year. Venture deal count dropped by 45%. And this year to date has been tracking to be the slowest year for capital raised and deal count since 2017. And yet what's interesting is that we're kind of seeing this simultaneously the most competitive dynamic in landscape ever, with this very high record level of dry powder chasing after this much more select group of companies that have actually built great businesses, but as many of you know, aren't actually going on to raise in this environment. So what's happening, right? When you kind of take a step back, I would say there's sort of two forces or two pressures from opposing sides that are kind of convening to be driving this phenomenon. So the first is, the truth is that competition has exploded in venture and private equity. Just in the US, fund counts annually created per year more than doubled between 2017 and 2022. Capital raised more than tripled in that time. And at the same time, as interest rates started hiking last year, the public market started getting a little bit shaky, every investor simultaneously tightened their diligence and investing criteria to be much stricter. And so in the spirit of that strictness, there just are not enough good deals to meet this criteria. And so that's created this much more competitive hunt and dynamic with all the other funds that are out there to look for a much more select set of companies. Now, I don't have to belabor this point. You know, like venture ultimately, at the core, what it is, it's the finding and picking winners game, right? So the question really is, how do you find and identify every company or founder as early as possible that's relevant to your thesis? And so traditionally, the way that worked in the industry is it was very human-centric. It was more artisanal maybe than it was scientific. It was about networking, mentoring, building your brand and reputation, fielding the inbound deal flow that came your way as a result of that reputation, right? But it's also a new world that we're all operating in right now. And so I think no one can really, understandably, win anymore by sitting in an ivory tower and relying on inbound in the companies that you know. You have to be more systematic. You have to be more innovative. And that's why I would say I've seen the majority of firms that I talk to really finding themselves with no choice but to become a lot more creative in their investment processes and their data and technology stacks. And by the way, all of that happening at the same time in this more macro background when it's literally become 10 times harder to raise a new fund, as I'm sure many of us have felt. And so fundraising momentum has massively slowed down. In other words, the cost of just competing has really gone up. Now, that's not to say, obviously, just to be really clear, that like this traditional approach to venture deal making wasn't working fine until now, right? Despite the fact that it was very manual, very inefficient, I would say very subjective and human-centric. But it worked not because it was flawless, but because there was this relative lack of enormous competition and this like stricter investing lens that we've all adopted that we're now all facing. And so that has really pushed both VC and PE investors today to innovate. And it's why nearly every firm has been turning to data automation to gain a competitive edge. So this brings me to my topic for my talk today, and what I'm really seeing unfold as the future of private capital. And in fact, my singular goal today is to convince you data-driven investing is the biggest transformation that private capital as an industry has gone through since the last decade. And I want to share a specific, like, tactile vision for what it's going to mean to be data-driven over the next 10 years across literally every aspect of what an investor does. It's from sourcing to portfolio value creation to fundraising, and how all of these things ultimately tie together, how they're intimately interlinked. Okay, so that begs the question, right? Like, what is the data-driven investor? How do we actually define that? And maybe as a quick prelude, I know this term data-driven, it can feel pretty pedestrian. Like, it's hard to point out any industry in the world that like hasn't become more data-driven to some extent, right? But what I'm here to tell you is this is very real. Like, don't like read into the word for what the word is. It's this very specific material shift and how I've observed PE and VC firms are now operating. And as a proxy, I think it actually helps to think about this and look at the hedge fund industry as a historic example. So up until the 1980s, hedge funds were mostly run by these Wall Street veterans who used their intuition, their human connections to make all their investment decisions. But then as more data became available, the infrastructure was built, there emerged this new breed of funds that were combining quantitative models with that human judgment to drive better decisions and better decision making and omit a lot of the human bias that came into the picture. And so private capital right now is at a very similar kind of inflection point. So what is data-driven investing? It's the concept, the idea of using all of the data available to you to either augment human decision making or automate away all of the human data entry and drudgery that has to flow into every aspect of what an investor does. So that's about really moving beyond this highly manual, human-centric, I would say really gut-driven approach of operating a firm and leveraging everything in the universe and the data you have access to. Private data, from communications, deal pipeline data, historic performance data, to third-party data about startups and founders and alternative signals, job movement, the whole universe of signals that are out there. And I will also say this is going to be the second wave of the data-driven investor. So let me tell you a story. My co-founder Shubham and co-CEO Shubham and I have been pretty much building software for private capital for literally the last decade now. Like we've seen really up close how our industry's perception of tools and data have shifted over the last 10 years. So we were both studying computer science at Stanford back in 2014, and we left to basically dedicate our lives to building better tools, right? That was founding Affinity. And coming from engineering backgrounds, we had this one very clear and I think reasonable expectation, which was certainly the people in the world that are funding and financing the most disruptive technology on the planet would be the ones using the most advanced technologies to run their firms themselves. And so to understand that reality better, we made it our literal mission to talk to every single investment firm on Sand Hill Road and South Park down here in San Francisco, literally. Like we would alternate day by day. Like one day we'd drive to Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park. Other day we'd take the Caltrain to South Park to sit down with every single firm that was willing to talk to us and have them walk us through their tech stack, how they thought about the world. And what we were shocked to learn 10 years ago was the polar opposite of our expectations was actually true. So the only real digitization I would say that had happened in the industry was probably the transition from pen and paper to using a keyboard and a mouse. And this was the overarching problem across every single firm. In fact, I would say back then even, if you were diligent at that time, using any CRM and being consistent about it and convincing your partnership to be entering data into it regularly, you were probably already like, a standout. Like that was the state of the art. It was literally manual data entry and human memory. No automation. You want access to your firm's relationships. LinkedIn and human memory were basically like the best solutions. And the few company data sets that people did use, maybe Crunchbase, maybe PitchBook, they were siloed, they were disconnected from each other, they were definitely not connected to the CRM. And so we kept hearing over and over again something along the lines of like, yeah, I know we invest in tech, but it's ridiculously stupid how bad our internal tech is. Like, if I had $1 for every single time someone told me that, as if I was hearing it for the first time, we probably would have started Affinity Ventures instead of Affinity Software Company. Now, one thing became painfully clear, right, across all these conversations, at least kind of putting on our engineering hat, which is a huge proportion of this manual data entry can be automated, the stuff that makes CRM adoption practically impossible. And specifically, if you tap into this ocean of data that lives across all the information that your firm owns but doesn't realize it owns, email strings, calendar streams, public data sets about people and companies and transactions, what fundraising events are happening around the world, you can actually put most of that data entry on autopilot. And so that became our obsession. It was, how do we access this wealth of data that already existed to automate as much of this human data entry out of the picture as possible? Now, we had that vision, but we also ran into a wall very quickly, right? Because back in 2014, 2015, like if it was rare for a firm to adopt any tools at all, it was straight up crazy to ask for someone to sync their most sensitive data into any platform. So we pitched so many firms and so many people on this idea, walked them through literally how it would work step by step, what's the architecture, how does it respect privacy and security? But we just got baffled looks. So it was not easy, just to be clear. But it was also the classic like crossing the chasm kind of mantra, right? There's this group of visionaries and early adopters, actually a number of them in the audience today, you know who you are, so thank you, who were just so fed up with failed CRM deployments and Salesforce deployments that they decided to opt in and they saw the light. And so fast forward today, 10 years later, these ideas have literally now become the gold standard for our industry. Like, if you're not using activity capture or relationship intelligence of some form in some sort of a solution, you're behind. And that was the first wave that we've already gone through, which is data-driven investing through automation. And it hasn't happened overnight, right? It's been this like decade-long transformation where the culture of our industry has fundamentally shifted. And again, something that's gradual, that's happened over time. I think we're very lucky to have considered ourselves, a small part in making that happen. So if I've convinced you by now that this is not just something I'm saying, but it's something, I've pretty credibly observed over the last decade, that brings me to today, because I'm seeing something happen right now, which is there's a second wave of data-driven investing happening. And it's a wave that we're not talking about. So in 2020, I started noticing this interesting trend, where I would say maybe more like a collection of trends. This is both spending time looking at our internal usage data on the product and talking with a lot of our customers. That's most of what I spend my time doing. So actually a few sub-trends, right? For one, usage of the Affinity API was massively spiking. You can actually see some of that here. Actually doesn't go all the way back to 2020. But basically, there is this very fast-growing contingent of customers that were pulling all of the insights, sucking the insights and data out of Affinity. That's information about strongest connections, intro paths, relationship strengths, data on founders and startups, and simultaneously pushing it back in from tools that they seem to be building in-house. At the same time, the average number of third-party data vendors exploded. So back in 2014, 2015, as I mentioned, it was probably all Crunchbase, maybe PitchBook. Now we are seeing this Cambrian explosion of alternative data vendors for just about every kind of signal you could possibly imagine. In fact, last year we surveyed over 300 investors among our customer base, and we found that the average investor at that time was using 5.5 data sources to source and evaluate deals just for that workflow. Blew my mind. I was like, what's happened? This is crazy. And lastly, I was talking personally to this increasingly growing cohort of engineers at VC and PE firms, which, again, 10 years ago was a rare, if not practically non-existent job. But today, if you look on LinkedIn, literally this is queried maybe last week, you'll find over 250 VC and PE engineering jobs. Okay, so what was happening, right? After having spent a lot of time talking to folks, I think what I've realized is private investing is becoming a lot more quantitative, and it's no longer just artisanal. Again, not to downplay the fact that there is always going to be this human intuition-driven component of it. But basically what a lot of firms started realizing was that the bar became higher in response to these dynamics that I talked about. And they needed this sort of superhuman vision to become aware of literally every company and deal within their competency in the space they invested in. Otherwise, you just miss out on great opportunities. And so to gain an edge, more and more firms are starting to integrate and acquire all the data sets that are relevant to them in the universe and build in-house solutions, of which Affinity was a really critical piece. And so this is the new data-driven investor. It's what I would call the second wave, because just with the sheer accessibility of so many data sets now, I think we're going to see a huge transformation over the next 10 years, fueled by data-driven approaches to every aspect of what it means to run a private capital firm. It's going to become the new gold standard. Okay, so let me tell you about one Affinity customer who's not just been a great example of this data-driven shift, but actually, I think interestingly enough, has been one of the few who have been uniquely open in sharing their approach to the world. So that customer is Early Bird Venture Capital. Early Bird's a European-focused VC firm. They were founded in 1997. They have over 2 billion euros in AUM. And specifically, I'm talking about Dr. Andre Radarath there, who is both the partner and the author of this blog called literally Data-Driven VC. At Early Bird, Andre personally leads development of their firm's proprietary engine for data-driven sourcing. They call it Eagle Eye, and they use Affinity as the core backend to run all that system. And so they developed Eagle Eye. At this point, it's ingesting hundreds of different data sources, everything from LinkedIn to Twitter, GitHub signals, product hunt signals, public register data, everything, including using Affinity's API to extract company data, relationship insights, and pipeline information, all of which they then plug back into their scoring models and proprietary sourcing engine. By the way, I didn't share anything I'm not supposed to because, Andre's a very good partner and friend, and he was, worked with him on all that, but he was more than okay with me sharing all that. So that's an example, really, I think, of a firm. And I think now the Early Bird example touches on one cut of how investing has become a lot more data-driven, which is sourcing, right? But obviously, there's a lot more that a venture fund does or a private equity firm does, and that Affinity helps with today. And so I think today at Affinity, we're proud of empowering more than 3,000 VC and PE firms in over 80 countries. And so when you really think about this like end-to-end value chain, we're going to walk through every step of it, of private capital. You have GPs raise capital from LPs. You find it invest in the best companies. You help your portfolio companies grow and succeed. All three of those pillars are going through this data-driven transformation. So let's maybe start with the most fundamental job, which is finding and investing in companies. So this is, I think, the most obvious pillar that's going through this data-driven change, because there's so much data available now on companies and founders, even proto-founders before they themselves realize that they want to start a company. Like that's how advanced, our signals have gotten. So this is everything from job change signals, company growth signals, website traffic signals, Twitter activity, GitHub activity. Everyone and everything in the world, literally in this age, has some kind of digital footprint now, right? And so the question is, can you collect every morsel and subset of that relevant data point from that footprint to develop this insane coverage, this superhuman coverage of where your investment thesis? And again, to be clear, that's not about replacing the human judgment or relationship part of it, but it's really about augmenting that. It's about giving you that visibility. Now, when a signal from sourcing becomes interesting, right? You either want to reach out or you're able to a relationship with that person, that's when it becomes a deal and it enters the deal pipeline. And so this is where really data automation and relationship intelligence come into the picture. It's about automatically updating all of your contact and deal records, logging interactions, keeping everything real-time and up-to-date for you 24/7 in the background. Relationship intelligence then generates insights, like who has the strongest relationship with this founder that we're really trying to talk to? Who knows this specific person, CEO, CFO? Have we already pitched them? What do we talk about? And then take a step further, if you then analyze historic deals and connect that back to your sourcing engine, you can then ask questions like, quantitatively, what were the factors that drove the success of our sourcing strategy or the failure? If we just completely remove human judgment, purely looking at historic data, what were the characteristics of the best companies? So let me tell you about a customer that's found success in building their deal flow on Affinity. That's Lower Carbon Capital. So Lower Carbon was founded in 2020 by Chris Sacca. It's his second fund. He previously founded Lowercase Capital, one of the highest performing seed funds. And Lower Carbon really exists to back the best deep tech founders fighting against climate change. So it's interesting, in chatting with Shuo Yang, one of their partners, for the Lower Carbon team, they had to literally first prove to themselves, before they even proved to their LPs, that they could generate the best possible deal flow in the climate space. So I'm going to quote Shuo. What he literally said was, their goal was to see and track literally everything in the climate universe, period. On Affinity, they found success by building lists to track that entire universe. Everyone in the world doing cutting-edge science and research on climate science. Top researchers at universities, PhDs, postdocs, the people who would become the proto-founders that they would end up backing before those people even realized that they wanted to start a climate company. And so Affinity enabled them to have this very clean, automated, organized data on every single one of those people and relationships in the universe, so they can hold their partnership accountable to driving the most founder-friendly and the fastest process. AI. You all thought I would do a keynote on danger investing and not talk about AI. But in seriousness, this is real, right? Like it was, I think maybe 2 to 3 months after the launch of ChatGPT that at some point I started getting asked in every single conversation what other firms were doing with using large language models and AI. And so I actually see a couple of killer applications for AI in the investor tech stack. I think it's something that's going to slightly lag behind what happens on the data-driven side, but it's all interconnected. So the first, maybe the most basic, is just rote productivity, right? This is about how do you streamline every one of the highest cost manual repetitive tasks that we all do. Outreach emails, intro emails, everyone builds market maps and industry reports. You're writing thought leadership and blog posts. And so many firms are adopting this AI-assisted research and writing to become more productive. But there's also another angle, which is interesting, which is how do you use AI to generate data, right? Because the question of data automation and human data entry, it's not like either you solve it or you don't kind of a problem, it's a spectrum. And so although we've automated a lot of data entry, there's still more that we could put on autopilot by leveraging AI-generated data sets. And so today, for example, most of us are still writing notes by hand. We're writing summaries, we're creating tasks and follow-ups, we're entering them into our CRM, we're updating statuses and owners manually by hand, right? And so we at Affinity are really, really excited about what's coming on this front. So actually a really huge focus for our roadmap. You're gonna hear later today from our head of product, Andy, about some of the things we've been working on this side. But we can do more, right? So I think even with productivity and data automation, I think this really only scratches the surface of what's possible in the future for the data-driven investor. I would say the most sophisticated application, I don't know, you might even call this the final frontier of data-driven investing, is basically building an AI co-pilot that helps you with decision-making itself. It's something that's always been conventionally thought of as like a human-centric or human-only thing, right? So it's really about using all of your historic performance data across every phase of the investment value chain, sourcing, screening, deal flow, and then feeding it back into an AI model that learns and self-improves. It's also answering questions like, what deals did we miss? What were the signals that existed among all signals, even the ones that we weren't necessarily paying attention to, that signaled to us that this was a good investment? And then automating and testing your hypothesis and refining it over time. And so longer term, I think this is really where we're heading, kind of this concept of an AI co-pilot that helps with decision making. All right, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So let's talk about portfolio success. When you think about the private capital value chain, obviously a big part of it is finding and making the right investments. but just after that is helping your portfolio company succeed, right? So there's more that's top of mind here than ever, just given how many companies have been struggling since the market downturn that started last year. Actually, when we surveyed our customers last year in that same market survey I talked about, we found that 30% of investors were planning to focus the number one majority of their time helping portfolio companies navigate the coming downturn. So that really says something about how much of a priority this has become. And we actually see this in Affinity usage as well. So today, it's kind of crazy. Nearly 20% of lists that are managed on Affinity are being used to support workflows and use cases to help empower and support portfolio companies. And so it's clearly one of the biggest workflows and use cases that reflects that prioritization. Now, warm intros and data are some of the most valuable assets that any investor can offer to a portfolio company. And so in a data-driven world, the question that we really think about is, are you able to get instant access to insights like, literally right now, what are the 20 most valuable customer intros that we can make to our entire early stage SaaS portfolio? Who knows this specific investor, this specific C-level candidate, this corporate partner that our portfolio founder is trying to connect with, right? You should also be able to report on your portfolio value creation and drive accountability. So kind of how many of us can answer questions like, how responsive is our firm to our portfolio companies' asks over the last quarter? How has that changed? What percentage of asks that were made did we actually fulfill? You should be able to get like arm's length, fingers length access to answers to questions like that. And so again, later today, you're gonna hear from Andy about some of the exciting work that we're doing to enable portfolio collaboration workflows and use cases, although this is a long-standing effort. There's a lot to be built here in this space. Okay, I'll share one more example of a firm that's found a success with Affinity powering their portfolio value creation. That's Teamworthy Ventures. So Teamworthy is an early stage VC firm. They're based out in Connecticut. It was founded by Thomas Lerman, who is also the founder of GLG, which maybe some of you use, some of you don't. So their focus as a firm is really specifically on maximizing value for founders through making the most helpful introductions in the industry to new customers, partners, and hires. It reflects in their name, being Teamworthy. And so they run their Monday morning meetings today. They've built this habit of doing it all in Affinity dashboards. So every single Monday, the Teamworthy team comes together and systematically reviews every single portfolio company, cross-checks against each partner's connection strengths, and methodically assigns tasks to everyone to introduce either one new customer, partner, or advisor based on who they know. And so that data-driven workflow has become basically central and core to their value creation and their value proposition. It's their operating heartbeat and rhythm. Okay, it's one thing to support portfolio companies to help them grow, right? It's obviously another to actually monitor their performance and their health through collecting metrics. And that too is like a data and workflow problem. And so I want to just shout out Vestberry, who's co-sponsoring this event. Vestberry, they built a fantastic portfolio intelligence tool for VCs to collect portfolio company metrics, turn them into internal analytics and easy to share LP reports. And so they built not just a best-in-class solution, but are also building a great native integration with Affinity so your data can flow seamlessly between all of your systems, whether it's relationships, deals, or portfolio metrics. Okay, and that brings me to the final piece maybe, speaking of LP reporting of the value chain, which is fundraising and managing LPs, right? Again, I probably don't have to say this too much. This is one of the most top of mind things for all of us because it's harder than ever. Not just because startup fundraising has slowed, raising a new fund has become probably 10 times more difficult. And again, you look at our usage data, right? The importance of that shows in the usage metrics. And so another look at how our customers are using Affinity, 28% of lists that are being actively managed now are being used to run LP management and fundraising workflows. So again, that really shows the importance of that. And I would say really importantly, kind of speaking of a holistic worldview, this is very deeply linked back to all the previous things that we talked about. Because again, it's a data and workflow problem. So on one hand, it's about having performance metrics and data across every part of your operations to be able to share with LPs and prospective LPs. What's our competitive edge in sourcing right now? Are we able to actually measure how effective that is? How is our portfolio performing and how effective are we actually at helping our companies as quantified and measured through data? It's also about leveraging relationship intelligence to uncover all the best intro paths into potential LPs when you are going out on a fundraise. And so there are some pretty amazing things that we intend to invest in here on the product side over time. So I think maybe just to leave you with a note, right? None of these things can be built in isolation. They have to be deeply linked together to be integrated to kind of enable this wholesale vision or future for data-driven investing. And so this is our goal as a company. We want to build for you all the operating platform for private capital by either building these new capabilities in-house, into our platform, or integrating with the best-in-class existing tools or your in-house tools. I think it's all within the scope of this longer-term macro vision. I hope I've convinced you that the future of private capital is data-driven. That this isn't just some genericism that I'm saying, but it means something very discrete and specific that's happening right now. And it's happening today. It's everyone is doing it to some degree. We're just not talking about it. And that it will become the new gold standard. And we're very excited about that feature at Affinity, and we're excited to build it with you and for you. So welcome to Campfire. Really excited for you all to be here. Thank you.